Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this weekly Greater Manchester COVID-19 briefing, joined today by two Deputy Mayors, Sir Richard Leese and Baroness Beverly Hughes, who I will hand over to in just a moment. Obviously, a lot's happening and a lot to update you on. And the position in Greater Manchester is, of course, one that continues to change. And I'll now hand over, if I may, to Sir Richard Leese, who will take you through the figures. I'll ask then Bev to say something about the impact on policing and the pressure on policing, and then I will talk to where we are with the government and how we move forward from here. So I'll start with Richard. Over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Good afternoon, everybody. Got the table in front of us that shows the 7-day rate of positive tests per 100,000 population. Clearly, the big news has been around Bolton, which has seen a very rapid increase in its number, although the information we have from the Director of Public Health in Bolton is that reflects cases all over the borough. It's not isolated to any particular area and seems to be very, very widely spread across Bolton. Stockport has continued to come down. Generally speaking, there isn't actually a lot of change around the rest. And if you look at the 4 weeks and across the whole lot, and the classic case is Tameside, which is exactly now where it was 3 weeks ago, but that's pretty much the pattern across the piece, that places have had ups and downs, but actually the overall movement is not that great. And I think one of the questions we have to ask arising from that is the extent to which local lockdown, the measures imposed by government, are actually having any impact whatsoever. Delighted to see that Oldham's figure continues to come down, but again, I mean, we believe that's rather more to do with the intensive targeted work that they've been doing in Oldham rather than the fairly arbitrary borough-wide measures that have been imposed upon them. But I think some big questions there. I think the other big question is that given the lack of movement there, given that we don't have a cure for COVID-19, given that there isn't a vaccine, is this something, the sort of position that we're going to bump along in for a very long period of time until we do get either a successful vaccine or we do get a cure? They're not questions that there are obvious answers to, but we do know that COVID isn't going to go away unless there is a cure or vaccine, and that does mean or implies that we have to manage it in a different way. And I think when I finish after Bev, that Andy's going to say a bit more about the discussions we've been having, the thinking we've been doing about how we need to handle it in a different way. As well as the figures up there, they show Wigan and Stockport are now green. Everybody else is amber, apart from Oldham, who are still in red, but are clearly moving rapidly back into amber. If we look at the positivity rate for tests, I can say that from the numbers we've got, every single district in Greater Manchester tested fewer people in the past 7 days than they had in the previous 7 days. So what's happening has got nothing to do with increased testing. So there hasn't been increased testing. But in terms of the positivity rate, on the government's rag rating, 9 of the 10 districts are rated green. Only one's rated amber, which is Bolton, and Bolton's just crept above the 4 mark that puts them into amber. In terms of 111 triage calls across Greater Manchester, the total movement from 1 week to the next has been 2. It's down 2. So again, we're not having people contacting 111. We're not having people contact their GPs, nor are we getting people contacting their hospitals. And I'm going to give you some figures that compare that week ending the 29th of August with a similar week at the end of April, the week ending the 27th of April, because the change in the figures is quite stark, actually. If you compare 27th of April, hospital admissions for COVID-19 daily admissions was 38. Over the past week, it was 2 a day. In terms of number of patients in intensive care, 27th of April, it was 136 in Greater Manchester. Now it's 15. In terms of non-intensive care cases in hospital, in 27th of April, it was 827. It's now 69. And on the death rate, and clearly we don't want anybody to be dying of an infection, but for that week ending the 27th of April, the number of deaths in hospital was 237. For the past week, it's 8. I'm going to have to qualify that a little bit. I've seen a published figure from, I think it's a Health Service Journal. It gives a figure of 17. I've gone back and checked the figures, and the figures we use are NHS England figures, and they give for the period ending the 29th of August, Greater Manchester, a death rate of 8. And I think that those comparisons are important because it shows that what we're dealing with now is very, very different to what we were dealing with in April. It might be the same infection, but it's having an impact on different people, and it's a different and much smaller impact at the moment. And if what we're dealing with is different, then that suggests that we need to be managing it differently. And something I have said previously, it needs to be managed within a context. And COVID-19 is clearly still epidemic. That there's no doubt about that. It's still endemic across Greater Manchester. But there are other health issues now very clearly having a bigger impact on people's lives. Reported previously, the massive increase in the number of people reporting mental health problems. There are tens of thousands of people who have suffered and continue to suffer delayed treatment, and some of those are delayed treatments for illnesses, for example, cancer treatments that are potentially life-shortening if you don't get the treatment quick enough. We know that people are still not presenting in the numbers you would expect for things like cancer. There is the impact on the economy, and we know that economic deprivation, poverty, is a killer. It will shorten people's lives. And there are other infections as well. As I understand it, there are things like summer flu has now got a higher death rate in the UK than COVID-19 has. All of those need to be balanced. And something I've talked about is that we need to have a proportionate approach to the issues we're facing. The evidence would suggest at the moment that we probably haven't got that, and that we do need to be doing things to manage COVID-19, but manage COVID-19 with the overall context of everything else that's going on in Greater Manchester as well, and particularly those other things that do have an impact on people's life expectancy. I think that covers the numbers. I think, yeah, that's I think what I'd want to say about that, Andy, but I'll leave some of the conclusions to you when you speak later.
Many thanks, Richard. What I'll now do is invite Deputy Mayor Baroness Beverly Hughes to talk about the ongoing pressure on Greater Manchester Police, because it is intense and possibly not sustainable given the resources that they have at the front line. But Bev, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Well, looking back at last weekend first, the bank holiday weekend, those 4 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday as well. It was not generally as busy as it has been in previous weekends, and there were some positive elements in that. We didn't have any illegal raves or any large unlicensed music events, unlike some of our other towns and cities across the UK. So we did not issue the first £10,000 fine in Greater Manchester. But in other respects, the weekend was busy. A car cruise was disrupted. There were Black Lives Matters and Extinction Rebellion protests across the weekend. Indeed, that the Extinction Rebellion is continuing all week. And people out on the streets in support of Manchester Pride, despite the online festival. But in fact, all of those events were conducted responsibly, and they passed without incident. And I do want to thank the police and their local authority partners who worked all weekend together, and the public too, generally, who respected the restrictions largely, not completely, but largely, and I think made for a much more manageable weekend than we've had in previous weeks. The COVID-related activity was also very prominent, though, over that weekend, over that 4 days. We had almost 7,999 calls, 5,101 calls, 12,000 in total. In addition, the public made 600 reports of COVID-19 incidents and licensing breaches. And of those, nearly 400 were reports of house parties. You know, there were not small parties, but on a scale to come to the attention of neighbours and be reported to the police, and 140 reports of licensed premises breaches too. So as well as attending to all of those reports, police officers and our local authority partners visited 548 licensed premises to undertake the test and tracing systems and audit them and make sure they were compliant, and looked at evidence of any breaches. In the main, where there were found to be COVID-19 restriction breaches, the businesses responded well. There were, however, 11 arrests and 25 fixed penalty notices were issued over those 4 days. And in addition to all that activity, the police officers based at Manchester Airport have since March been undertaking physical quarantine checks on people returning from overseas, and there were 236 of those between March and May, a 6-week period, and just one fixed penalty notice issued. So that's the kind of picture on the COVID front over that period of the bank holiday. And if you'll have noticed the press notices being sent out, you'll have also seen that it was a very significant period in terms of non-COVID related police activities, with 2 attempted murders, a significant number actually, of very serious assaults where arrests have been made. In the last 2 days as well, 2 serious multiple stabbings, again arrests have been made, several rapes, and 3 young people on ventilators over the weekend after taking what we think is LSD at a party. Again, arrests have been made, and investigations on all of those incidents are continuing. I think, you know, it's time that we just kind of looked at this whole issue of enforcement, important though it has been, certainly early on in this period, when there was much greater clarity about what the public was being asked to do in order to protect ourselves. But I think enforcement now is increasingly more challenging for the police and for our local authority partners for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think the restrictions on family gatherings in houses and gardens is both resented, I think, by the public, who see it as inconsistent with being allowed to mix with family and friends in a pub garden, for instance. And it's also virtually impossible for the police to enforce that, unless a gathering of a family is on such a scale that there is noise and it's noticeable by neighbours. The police cannot possibly enforce that restriction. And, you know, I think the second factor, in addition to that, is that we've now got variation across our boroughs in Greater Manchester in terms of which restrictions apply, and that makes it difficult to enforce by the police. And then I think thirdly, which I think Andy will come on to and Richard has touched on as well, we've got confusion now and complete lack of clarity by the government, oscillating in terms of what restrictions should apply where. And I think this is, this is bringing the kind of whole enforcement part of the equation really into disrepute. And it may be that that's reflected, for instance, in what happens to the fixed penalty notices, because I've been looking into that. I haven't got the figures up to date to now, but certainly for the period March to May, when Greater Manchester Police issued 305 fixed penalty notices, only 143 of those have been paid. So less than 50% of the people issued with a notice think it's worth paying. They may end up in court, but the situation in court is such with their backlogs that they may not. So there's a lack of credibility now, I think, in relation to those powers of enforcement. And I think for enforcement to be an effective contribution to managing and minimising the spread of the virus, it's got to make sense to the public. It's got to be feasible for the police to implement. And it anyway can only ever be one element in that process of management. And I think, we're at the situation now, it seems to be the only tool in the government's box of tricks really at the moment is enforcement. And I think, we're going to talk today a bit about having a different approach to how we manage the situation going forward. So I'll leave it there, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bev, and thank you, Richard. I won't go over what's been announced today by the government. You'll all be familiar with that. What I wanted to do was actually just start by speaking directly to the people of Greater Manchester, particularly the people of Bolton and Trafford, because I'm sure they're feeling fed up, frustrated, possibly confused, like everybody is to some degree, given the complete chaos really we've seen over recent days. So what I would say, certainly to the people in Bolton, the figures Sir Richard has shown tell the story. I mean, it's impossible really to predict what would have happened in the last few days, given where Bolton has been for a number of weeks now. So I hope they will know that, when we supported the leader of Bolton Council in making his request to the government yesterday, it was with their health in mind, their family's health in mind. It's a different situation with Trafford, because the leader of the council there, on advice from his Director of Public Health, took a clear view last week that it wasn't right to lift the restrictions because of what they could see coming through in the data, and it's disappointing, obviously, that that was not followed. So in the case of Trafford, obviously, while people may be feeling disappointed today, we would say that probably the hope should never have been raised, and really the government all along should have listened carefully to what was being said by the leader of the council and the Director of Public Health. What we would say today is that Greater Manchester is united. I want to pay tribute actually to the leaders of Bolton and Trafford for the way they've handled a very difficult situation. We support them, and what I'm about to talk to you about is a position that we all now agree. And I think perhaps the reason why our voice is getting heard by the government nationally is because we are united and hopefully clear in what we are saying. So just to talk, if I may, though, around the restrictions that are still in place in 8 of our boroughs. I mean, given the figures that we've got this week, obviously with the schools returning and without alternative measures in place on the ground, it wouldn't be right to remove the measures in Bolton and Trafford. It would have obviously sent the wrong message at the worst possible time to those communities. However, agreeing with what Bev has just said and Sir Richard before Bev, these crude blanket restrictions can only now be seen as an interim measure. We need to plan for an exit strategy from this to a much more sophisticated approach, more targeted approach, high impact interventions in our communities, door to door, testing, tracing, giving messages out to local communities. That is what we know to have worked in Rochdale, Oldham, Stockport, All the boroughs are trying it to some degree, but what we're saying is if we can do that on a scale across all 10 boroughs, then we are confident that that is the best way to keep the numbers in a place where we believe they then don't pose risk to those communities. So what we want to do now, having got to this sort of, if you like, holding position with the government, and that's the way I see it, it's a holding position. We all feel we need to plan for the phase beyond these restrictions where they can be removed in all boroughs, and we can enter a new phase that is a much better way, we think, of managing the risks that we face, as Sir Richard said. So let me take you through the elements of that strategy. And I have spoken to the Health Secretary about this. I'll obviously want to follow up that discussion with him. You know, we're not in the business today of going over who said what to who, or, you know, there's no politics here. I keep saying that, and I mean that. This is about getting the right solution for Greater Manchester, a solution that protects people's health, but also allows people to return safely to school, to the office. And this is what we're trying to build, learning from everything we've been through on this journey so far. So in this exit strategy, I see 4 points, and I just want to take you briefly through them. The first is local control of the test and trace system. The national system isn't working for us. It really isn't. We need to be able to get control of resources to build door-to-door operations in our communities that can do all of the work that I just mentioned, the testing, the tracing, giving of direct messages to the public. That is what we know is what works. And the government made a promise a few weeks ago to reallocate human and possibly financial resources from the national system and reallocate them to councils. We haven't seen that yet, but we need to see that resource reallocated. In some of our boroughs, we've been working with volunteers, and it is a bit galling for people volunteering in the community door-to-door work to then read reports in newspapers of people working on the national system talking of not having received a single phone call in the course of a month. That just cannot be right. We need a major reallocation of resources here to the community level, resources under the control of our councils to build a local test and trace operation that goes door to door and, you know, makes that kind of human contact with people and supports them to manage the virus within their own environment. So then secondly, and very much linked to that, is a call that you've heard me make before, and that is financial support for people to self-isolate. It was good that the government made a nod in this direction last week with the announcement of a pilot scheme in Pendle, Blackburn and Oldham. But I think at best you would describe it as the merest of nods. £13 a day. The Health Secretary's already told us that he couldn't live on that. Who can live on that? You know, it shouldn't be the case that to self-isolate and do the right thing that we all need people to do, you end up in family debt. You end up unable to afford the new school uniform for your children. I mean, that can't be what we're asking people to do. We need that system that we've described as being akin to jury service, where people can self-isolate immediately in the knowledge that their wages will be covered. And until we have that, we don't believe NHS test and trace will work properly. We're now in the autumn. We're now at the point where schools are returning. This can't be a kind of ongoing debate anymore. This needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed now, because as we're saying to you today, we want to be able to support people to return to work and to school, but that NHS test and trace system is critical to that, and still it's not working properly, and it needs to. And we believe we can make it work properly with local control and that financial support that I've mentioned. If I could just go through some of the extra points that we want in this exit strategy. Obviously, while we don't want to see the restrictions remain, and we'd like to see them lifted as soon as possible, they're necessary for now, but we want to move beyond them. We would though maintain in place advice, general advice about minimising mixing in the home. Of course, that is sensible, and we would give out strong messages to that effect across Greater Manchester. And then the final element of the exit strategy is really saying to government, we need a change here between the balance local to national. We are closer to our communities. Where there are decisions to be made about Oldham, Stockport, Bolton or Trafford, we're closer. And I think the last few days has shown that. We know it better than they do. Certainly the leader of Trafford Council would be saying that very much today. You know, it's time to put councils and therefore local communities in control of these restrictions. We need to do all of the preventative measures that I've spoken about through a localized test and trace operation, but having those restrictions then as a sort of last resort. As Bev just said, you know, currently it's like they're the only resort. You know, the government isn't doing the earlier things, but is just sort of taking these quite high-handed decisions just to impose restrictions on communities. That isn't the way to go. And you also get the confusion that we've got now of some areas being in, some being out. In Bradford, a split within one borough, and how on earth that is meant to be manageable, I honestly don't know. It's time to put councils and communities in control of this process as part of this exit strategy that I'm describing. And we want to talk to the government, as I say, without looking backwards or anything that's happened in the last few days, looking forwards to get this thing working. So that's where we are. We're I suppose some way forward than we were this morning, with obviously the position stabilised in Bolton and Trafford. I say again to people there, you know, we absolutely understand how you feel, and this on-off situation is the worst of all worlds, and you know that's got to be avoided. We need to get back here to a clear, understood approach for the whole of Greater Manchester. That's the basis of the plan that I've just put before you, to help people get back to work. And I should say, actually, and I repeat this call that I've made to this briefing for a number of weeks now, we see no reason why there are still restrictions on businesses like beauty salons, bowling alleys, play areas, casinos being prevented from opening. We think they should be allowed to open in all 10 boroughs. And I ask the government to consider that request as part of its gold meeting that I think will take place tomorrow. You know, we've got to get the health of the economy in our mind as well as obviously maintaining the spread of the virus. And that's a call that we repeat again, because we have no evidence that spread is taking place in those locations. So I will leave it there. I think you have a clear sense now of where we're coming from and where we want to go. I think this day needs to mark a kind of line, if you like, in terms of the way the government has been running things today. National government sitting in Whitehall imposing decisions on local communities has got to stop. We can't have that anymore. It isn't working. It's confusing people. It's causing anger and resentment. We need to move now to a new, more sophisticated approach as soon as we possibly can. I've outlined the basis of it today. What we will be doing now urgently is preparing this as a detailed proposition to the government with the funding request attached to it. It will be going to the government hopefully this week or certainly early next. And on that basis, we will seek to then move beyond these restrictions. And I can give at least the public some hope today that, you know, we see them now as not lasting more than a couple of weeks or so before we can move hopefully into a new phase with the agreement of the government, and that's what we want. So thank you, Ross. I will hand back to you to take us through the questions.
Thanks very much. I'm going to get straight into it and take two questions on a similar vein. The first one's from Helen Pidd at The Guardian for you, Andy. Was it your understanding that the lockdown restrictions lifted at midnight, i.e. 14 hours ago, in Stockport, Bolton and Trafford? Government are now saying that the changes only took effect at noon today, presumably so that it didn't look like a U-turn. And Rob at Channel 4 News, the government are saying the restrictions in Bolton and Trafford were never actually lifted. They apparently, in inverted commas, paused the lifting. Is that your understanding, and were you told that lifting restrictions had been paused yesterday?
Okay, so Helen, on your question first, it was my understanding that they were lifted at midnight, because that's what happened with Wigan. So there was a clear precedent last week where the decision was announced with respect to Wigan, and it would be a midnight Tuesday going into Wednesday, and regulations were laid to that effect. And then the government made a similar announcement about Trafford, Bolton and Stockport last week. And absolutely, that is what we were expecting. I don't recall any reference to noon. But, you know, Helen, I think this is the point. I'm not, in the business of sort of proclaiming U-turn, or that isn't the issue. The issue is not having a confusing situation that alienates the public. And this should have been avoided, because we wrote to the government yesterday, both the leaders of Bolton and Trafford individually, myself, on behalf of Greater Manchester. You know, we didn't need to be in this position. And there is obviously a learning there for the government in terms of improving things as we go forward. But for me, it's not about, is it a U-turn, is it not a U-turn? They made the wrong decision in overturning the request from Councillor Andrew Weston last week, or ignoring it, I should say. And that is a lot of where the problem comes from. And they've got to get better at listening to what local leaders are saying. And Rob, on your point, again, I mean, I think this is sort of Westminster sort of kind of spin, I guess, or tittle tattle or what, I don't know. But no, as far as we're concerned, it wasn't that the restrictions were paused. The regulations weren't issued, so we didn't see the regulations overnight or this morning. So I don't. If that was a deliberate government decision, well, they should have announced that yesterday so that everyone was clear going into Tuesday, and they didn't do that. So I honestly don't know. I don't think they did pause them, because if they had have done, you'd have expected a Conservative government to tell the Conservative leader of Bolton Council.
Thanks, Andy. Unless anybody else wants to come in on that one? Nope. Fab. James at the Bolton News asks, do you welcome the decision made by the government to keep Bolton in local restrictions? Do you think it should have been made last night to avoid any confusion caused to residents because of the crossover?
I mean, I just said that, James. I do. It's the right decision. And obviously, I need to say this particularly to the Bolton News. It was primarily the decision of the leader of Bolton Council, supported by his cabinet, but I should also say supported by the Labour opposition, and indeed all parties in Bolton. And I think that says something. It should say something to the residents of Bolton, who, as I say, are going to feel a lot of frustration today. It was recognised by all political parties that even though these things are hard sometimes and maybe lose us some favour or support or whatever, elected politicians do have to do the right thing when confronted with figures like Sir Richard presented to us for Bolton, given the change from this time last week to now. You have to act on that. There is just absolutely no other way of approaching these things. So it's the right decision given where we are, and I think the political unity about the decision says something. This is about protecting the health of families in Bolton. Kids are going back to school. People are being asked to return to the office. The risks have increased this week from where they were last. If you look at that change in Bolton, just to say, oh, we just plough on and remove the restrictions, it wouldn't have been the right message to send out. It would have left people completely, I think, confused by what's happening. It's bad enough where we find ourselves today, but it's actually better than it would have been to carry on with the restrictions lifted. But as I said, what we've now got to do is plan for a proper exit strategy from these restrictions within a matter of hopefully, I would say, a couple of weeks, and then I think help everybody move beyond what has been a really tough few weeks in Greater Manchester.
Thanks. If nobody wants to come in on that one, move straight on to Jessica Hill from the Local Government Chronicle. Question for Andy, and then take it to Richard. Do you think MPs should be given equal weight to building a COVID consensus to that of the council leader, with all the intelligence and expertise of local authority, including public health, behind them?
Well, Ross, I just can't wait to hear Richard's response to this. So I think I'm going to hand over to him. And as a former MP, I'm going to be fascinated to hear his views. And maybe I'll come after.
As a former MP, if you come in after and contradict me, I want to come back again, and we'll have a nice row. I think, Jessica, you very cleverly answered your own question, really, and it's that bit with all the intelligence and expertise of the local authority, including public health, behind them. Clearly, MPs have a job to do in representing their constituents and putting forward a case on their behalf. But at the end of it, they're legislators, that they are not managers or overseers of local services, and they don't have access to all the information that leaders of councils do have through our public health professionals. And of course, our public health professionals have access to confidential information that allows them to be able to form very clear judgments now about where transmission is taking place, how it's taking place, how it's spreading, and that allows us, I think, to make far finer tuned judgments than either our members of parliament, or going back to what Andy's been saying recently, the Secretary of State and his advisors down in Whitehall. They might be able to look at the big picture stuff, but they can't get down to the fine grain that is required in order to be able to effectively manage what it is that we're facing at the moment. So the views of MPs are very welcome. I have the greatest respect for the MPs in the city of Manchester. 4 of them used to be councillors, actually. One of them used to be the leader of a council, so they do know something about what it's like within a local authority. But even they would know that actually it's a lot different sitting in Westminster than it is to sitting in the town hall, actually having to manage and exercise control over these services.
Thanks, Andy. Did you want to come back in on that one?
Only to agree, Ross. The answer to the question is no, they shouldn't be given equal weight. As Sir Richard said, they should be given weight, but not equal weight. And I just need to add just one observation. Some of our MPs, in my view, the minute that we agreed to go with what the government was suggesting a month or so ago with restrictions on Greater Manchester, I think brought some political considerations into this which weren't helpful at all. So immediately there was an attempt to politicise the whole question of Greater Manchester restrictions, and I hope some of them will reflect today on that. You know, we work with their government, a Conservative government, to try and do the best thing. The government, like us, was trying to do something about the rises that we were seeing. As we've said today, you know, an imperfect instrument, of, you know, a blunt tool, if you like, the restrictions, but nevertheless, something needed to be done at that time. And you know, the MP involvement has brought a bit of politics to this. It's also brought a parochial view rather than the bigger picture view. And that's why I don't believe the voices of MPs should be given equal weight in this. Weight, but by no means the same weight as the leader of a council. And in my view, this is what I just want this to be clear too. The primary decision maker for me here is the leader of the council concerned. And they are closest to their community. They have got the primary duty to protect the health and welfare of their residents, supported by myself and Greater Manchester, and that's the way we're working here, and I'd ask the government to do the same.
Thanks, Andy. A question from Joshie Herman at the Mill. Last week you told us we can say with some confidence that the restrictions have worked, but just now Sir Richard said that we have to wonder whether the restrictions are doing anything at all. Do you agree? Do you disagree with him? Or has the thinking of the GMCA changed? If so, what's changed your mind?
No, I don't disagree with him, and actually the position hasn't changed. So, Joshie, just let me explain what I meant, which actually hasn't changed. The restrictions did work in stopping the rise that we were seeing across 9 of our 10 boroughs at that time. You know, we saw that simultaneous rise, which was what was worrying the government, but also ourselves. And I think the effect of the restrictions coming in and perhaps the surprise that it caused amongst the public created that change in behaviour, which I think brought about a change in the trajectory of the cases, and we began to see them having increased begin to fall, and the figures that you can see on the graph that Sir Richard presented show that. What I would say, so they did work, but what I would say is, agreeing with Richard, the effect has diminished over time. The further on we get, the less and less effective they're becoming, and I'd agree. What the figures show is a sort of plateauing now in the figures, and they're not creating a further reduction now. Perhaps they're helping hold things where they are, but they're not bringing things down in the way that we would want them to be. So they were right for the moment. those restrictions, GM-wide, were right at that moment in time, given what we were facing. But as we go further into this, they're becoming less and less effective. And it's why we're saying to you today, very clearly, that we need now to plan for an exit from those restrictions with a new, much more sophisticated, targeted, high impact strategy in our communities, combined with that financial support for self-isolation and the lead role for councils in making the calls in their areas. So, you know, that's what we're saying. Thinking hasn't changed. It's just that the restrictions, the longer they've been in, the more the confusion has grown around them, the less effective they're becoming.
Thanks, Andy. Jane Williams at the MEN asks, how much do you think that these requests will cost? What's your financial ask to the government?
Ross,
sorry, Richard.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the previous one, if you don't mind, and I'll read something that I wrote on the 21st of August, which addresses this directly, and it won't take long. Most weeks I do a press conference with the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, reporting back on what's happening in the city region with the coronavirus and what we're doing about it. Quite often we will say different things to what we have said in previous weeks, and rightly so. This is not political prevarication, or worse still, dishonesty. We're learning new things about the virus every week, and the way it impacts on our communities also changes. As our knowledge improves and circumstances change, our response to the crisis also needs to change. That's what we're doing, and our thinking, I think, has really evolved over the last couple of weeks in the way that Andy's described, about setting out what we now see as being a sound medium-term strategy to deal with the ongoing situation we face. Sorry to interrupt.
No apologies.
No.
Andy, if we're happy, I'll move on to Jane's question. So it was, how much do you think that these requests of government will cost? What is your financial ask to government?
Well, thanks, Jen. I mean, the answer to your question is we're working that up now. So I asked all districts yesterday to carry out an assessment of what they currently have on the ground with respect to that door-to-door capacity, what they think they need, so what the gap is between what they've currently got and what they would like to have if they were to do the most effective operation possible. And then we're obviously now costing the gap between what they've got to what they would like to have, and that ask will form part of the exit strategy that we present to the government, and we want to do that within a matter of days. I don't think it's going to be you know, a sort of exorbitant cost. That's not what we're doing here. Some of the funding might be held in the national test and trace operation. You know, there was a suggestion a few weeks ago that staff would be reallocated. I think they were talking of 6,000 staff being reallocated. Unless any of our districts can contradict me, I don't think we've seen much evidence of that change having happened. So it might not just be a financial ask, Jen, it might also be a human resources ask, and repurposing the kind of the role that people have been doing, rather than answering phones, getting people out, working directly in communities. All of our intelligence, I say again, tells us that is the most effective intervention we can make when it comes to containing this virus within communities.
Thanks. If nobody else wants to come in on that one, there's a few questions that I'm going to take together. Stephen Kingston at the Salford Star asks, he's not clear about the third part of the exit strategy. Are you saying that local councils should have the power to impose restrictions rather than the government? Jen Williams at the MEN says that, Andy, you said you want control to be passed to communities with lockdown only the last resort. Would either of you like the power to impose a local lockdown in extremis, or would you rather that remained with government? And also Kim Fitzpatrick, just above Stephen Kingston's question, asks his first question. I think you said current restrictions could be potentially lifted in a couple of weeks if the government takes on your new plan. Could you clarify how this could be achieved so quickly? So Stephen Kingston, Jen, on the powers to impose local lockdown, and then Kim Fitzpatrick's first question about the timescale.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So, Stephen, what I'm saying in the proposal is that the council should be the prime decision maker as to whether or not restrictions should be imposed. And then if they decide that they should or should be lifted, it's then going to government to ask for them to put in place the necessary support measures and perhaps have a discussion with the government. What we have at the moment is the opposite of that. Council sending letters in, ourselves sending letters in that may or may not get listened to. There's a process in Whitehall here, which is a bronze meeting on a Tuesday, a silver meeting on a Wednesday, chaired by the Chief Medical Officer. Then I think the Prime Minister or Health Secretary chairing the gold meeting on the Thursday. And it's like, you know, it's like waiting for the white smoke out of the Vatican. We're all waiting to say what have they decided about our community. And really, Whitehall should not be handing down decisions on communities without knowing those communities and what the effect of those decisions will be. You know, Oldham came close to facing a lockdown situation. And we all know, given the fragility of the economy in Oldham, the effects that would have had, the divisions that would have caused. So, you know, this isn't satisfactory. In my view, it's councils that need to be in the driving seat here, working then in consultation with the government and asking for the government's support to implement things where they need to. We've had an overly centralised approach to this virus so far. It cannot continue in this phase. Something very different is needed, and it needs to be rooted in local decision making and elected representatives. Jen, on your question, and maybe Richard wants to come in on this one as well. It's not so much the power to do it directly. It's more that the decision on whether or not it should happen should rest with the council. As I say, you know, we had a situation where Oldham Council did not want to see a full local lockdown on the Leicester model. They feared what that would mean for their community, but it came quite close. And what we would say is that the Oldham experience is important here because, you know, they successfully argued against it and then put in place the hyper local activity that has actually shown that it wouldn't have been needed because they brought the figures back down to a much better position. So, you know, that's what it's about. Councils in the driving seat, supported by the government. Of course, a discussion always between council leaders, myself and ministers to sort of negotiate what we think is the best. But I think the prime mover here needs to be local councils going forward. And Ross, did I miss the third question? Was it? It's
the first part of Kevin Fitzpatrick's.
Sorry.
He was just asking about the timeline.
So, Kevin, I mean, I'm only just giving people an indication. I mean, I can't, you know, the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want people to feel that they're just stuck in these restrictions forever. You know, I think that's really not what we want. And, you know, we see them as a very much interim phase here before we can agree this exit strategy. So I was just giving people a sense of, you know, what this might take in terms of time. A fortnight, possibly, I don't know, because obviously it depends on how those discussions with the government progress. It depends how the figures look, but you know, I don't think it need to take a huge amount of time. As Sir Richard has said today, we think the restrictions, although the best we've got at the moment without the alternative in place, are necessary, but are having less and less impact. And it's quite urgent actually to move beyond this phase to a much more targeted operation. So, you know, I'm saying that this to the local communities across Greater Manchester because I don't want them just to think that we're just stuck in this forever, because we're not. We need to move beyond it, and it could be within a couple of weeks if everything goes in the way that we want it to go.
Thanks. Going to bring in Richard. Sorry, Richard, you're muted.
If I can work backwards and address Kevin's question first about speed of being able to lift restrictions. Again, it's something that Andy talked about, is that the mechanisms that we think are working are ones that are already in play. They've certainly been in play in Oldham and Rochdale. It's what we've been doing in Manchester over the last few weeks, which is very targeted testing. Very intensive in some areas, working very strongly on public engagement, work using community champions as well as council and other officers to do that, and we believe that that's having an impact. So as we set out elements of the strategy, this is not something that will be starting from scratch. It will be something that is building on activity that's already taking place. The fundamental issue is there. I can say that for Manchester, for just 4 areas of the city, it's required 60 staff in order to carry out this intensive approach, and that's frankly at the moment a resource that we don't have, which is why we need that resource transfer in order to be able to operate this across the whole of the city region. But that could happen virtually instantly. It doesn't take any time at all, and I'd say what we need to do is already in place. I think in terms of addressing who should have the powers for local lockdown, although technically speaking it's not lockdown anyway, I think we need to go back to something else said, which is the wider impacts on health of people having delayed operations, people not being able to get other treatments, people having other illnesses, people by the thousands losing their jobs and more likely to lose their jobs over the future. And what that says to me is that if we're going to get that right, is that lockdown is something that should only be done in extremis. That is something we had in April, and if you look at the death rates in April, they were truly shocking. So we had those extremes then. That is not what we have now, and it's say about having an approach to managing COVID-19 that is proportionate to the circumstances that we are in. If you get down to that extreme circumstance where a lockdown is merited, then I think it probably should be a government decision, but a government decision made on the advice of local councils, as Andy's said previously. I think, does that cover it, Ross? Yeah.
Yep. What we'll do is I'll ask you the second part of Kevin's question as well. Can you tell me how many tests are being carried out in different boroughs? How much of a contribution does this make or not to rises in cases as you understand it?
Okay, hope you've got your pencil sharpened, Kevin. Across Greater Manchester, for the last week, there were 1,330 tests carried out for every 100,000 population. That's lower than the previous week, but again, the number goes up and down. These are Pillar 2 tests because hospitals and care homes are often using Pillar 1 tests. So that's a lot of the health sector is excluded from this testing. This is community testing we're talking about. The range there was from the lowest 822 to the highest 2,219, and to a certain extent that follows the range of issues that exist in different places. And again, if I gave you last week's figures or the week before's figures, they were different. They go up and down week to week. In terms of the positivity rate, and the positivity rate in Greater Manchester has, it's probably gone up by 0.4% over the last week. So slightly more positive, but again, that goes up and down in that sort of order pretty much every week and has done over the last few weeks. And if you take the place that has the most number of cases at the moment, which is still, of course, Oldham, Oldham was only about 4th or 5th in the positivity rate. So at the moment, whilst we think that targeted testing is really, really important in terms of being able to manage outbreaks, the quantity of testing in itself does not relate to the number of cases that we are dealing with. That's the evidence we've got at the moment. And I'm sorry, that is slightly complicated, and I'll try and find a way of simplifying it in the future, but sometimes you can't make complicated things simple, Kevin, but I'm sure the BBC can cope.
Ross, can I add one brief comment? It was just in respect of Trafford, where a new testing station opened in Trafford Park last week. I think comment has been made about the extra testing capacity having been the driver of the change in the Trafford figures. If the leader of Trafford Council was here, he would say this, so I will say it for him. There were actually, I think, as Richard was saying in the headline figures, there were fewer tests per 100,000 population carried out in Trafford last week, in the week in question, than there were the one before. So the increase that we see in Trafford can't be attributed to an increasing number of tests.
Thanks, Andy. Two more questions, one from Stephen Kingston at the Salford Star. He's saying that Salford Council has hardly said a word about any local outbreaks or testing figures or anything. Should local councils be providing more information to their residents rather than leaving it to Andy Burnham to say everything and take the stick on social media?
Well, I'm well used to the stick on social media, so that doesn't matter. It comes with the job, doesn't it? But no, I think, to be honest, Mayor Paul Dennett has said quite a lot actually about testing and local outbreaks. But what we've tried to do, Stephen, through this process is bring it together into one place in this weekly press briefing to prevent a sort of sense of confusion and further fragmentation. Things are fragmented enough, aren't they? What we're trying to do here every week is bring it into one place. And Sir Richard leads for us on health and care across Greater Manchester, so he is the right person to give you that overarching commentary across the whole piece. But I know Paul has been very vocal about testing throughout this, and has attended this press conference on at least a couple of occasions. So, we are trying to work as one. It's not about every council doing their own thing. We're trying to publish data for everywhere. And, I certainly think anyway, I hope that the Greater Manchester approach in terms of keeping you all informed has been helpful throughout this.
Thanks. If nobody has anything else on that one, then I'll go to the final question we've just got time for. Is Katie at That's Manchester. For you, Andy, Stockport's number of cases is encouraging as the local restrictions are lifted, but this comes as children go back to school and working parents are more able to go back to work. Are you concerned at all that this may result in steps backwards for the area? Navendu Mishra has called for more funding for schools to go towards measures to ensure schools are COVID secure. Do you agree that this is needed to keep COVID cases down as residents come out of local restrictions?
It's a good question, Katie. I mean, obviously, Stockport's figures are quite impressive, really. If you look at the trend downwards on the graph that we, or the table that we showed you, from 26.9 cases per 100,000 on the 8th of August week ending, down to 8.5 week ending 29th of August. So quite a change, and I think that was done with a huge amount of work by the council and health partners. I think I go back to what Sir Richard was saying at the start. There's going to be volatility in these figures, particularly as schools and offices return. And perhaps we need to become less sort of jumpy about changes in the figures going beyond this phase that we're in, and better at responding quickly on the ground when we see the change in the figures, rather than kind of you're in the blanket restrictions or you're out of the blanket restrictions. I think what we're saying to you today is that isn't the right way to go. I think we also perhaps have to take a slightly more sophisticated approach, not just looking at case numbers per 100,000, but looking at those alongside the hospitalisation figures, again, that Sir Richard gave, because if hospital admissions aren't rising, I think that is something that tells you about the level of risk that people are facing. So I think we've got, I hate to say this, but I feel I have to say this, the toughest time of this lies ahead of us, I think, now, and it starts right now, this week, and that's the autumn with the challenges it presents with schools, colleges and universities returning, and then of course the winter with the flu season starting, and the perhaps confusion that people may feel when they think they may have COVID when it's actually flu, and all of those issues, and then the pressure on hospital beds with the normal winter pressures that come. I'm really sorry to say that, because it's a pretty bleak thought, but it's true. We've got to gear up for that now, and I think we've got to get out of the chaos that we've seen in recent days, weeks. We are a devolved health system in Greater Manchester. Sir Richard leads it for us. We know we've got a lot of experience between us. Richard, 20 plus years as leader of Manchester City Council, myself as a former Secretary of State for Health. we're saying to the government today, listen to us, trust us. We will accept responsibility and the accountability that comes with that. If our claims don't work, we will be held accountable. We'd rather be in that position when we're in control of the decisions than in a sort of worst of all worlds at the moment, where we're asking for things, they're not being given on time, they're being ignored. We can't carry on like that. None of us can carry on like that. So that's very much our message today. Yes, there will be changes in the figures as we go through the winter and the autumn and the winter, but let's not overreact to that, but let's just get better at managing that and have the decision making, as we say, vested in the local authority, so that they can act more quickly than this sort of slightly clunky system we have at the moment, where we all have to wait a week at a time to find out the latest government's pronouncements on various communities. That isn't working. It needs to come to an end, and we need a better approach. And Ross, I'll just say as my final comment, I don't know whether Richard would like to make a final comment, or Bev. My final comment would be, having this system where the government just makes announcements about restrictions, it's almost as if that they're handing down judgments that are effectively cost-free to central government, because it doesn't cost them to make these pronouncements. But that then causes cost on the ground for local authorities as we then deal with the consequences of these decisions that are handed down. And it's impossible to justify that approach when we're not doing the things that will be preventative, the teams on the ground, the financial support for self-isolation. So currently, we're not doing the preventative things, the targeted preventative things. We're just doing the sort of reactive blanket things. That is really no way to proceed anymore. So we're in this interim position. We have to move beyond it. I think our views are clear. We want to do this in partnership with the government. As I say, the country faces a really tough challenge through the autumn and winter. We need to get back to a sense of national unity. We, as ever, are ready to play our part in that, and we ask the government to meet us in that offer. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, Andy. Did Bev or Richard want to come in? Richard?
I'll just make a final comment when Richard's spoken, if he wants to.
Okay, thanks, Beth. A couple of things. I've just dug some figures out for Kevin on the previous question, which I'll give him. They are Trafford figures, but they're from the weeks ending the 1st and 8th of August. So they're slightly historic, but I think they really starkly demonstrate the point that Andy made. Week ending the 1st of August, that the number of cases per 100,000 in Trafford was 33.7. The following week it was 21.1. In that first week, they carried out 1,525 tests per 100,000. In the second week, it's 1,756. So a significant increase in the number of tests. The number of cases actually went down significantly as well. I think it shows very clearly that there isn't a correlation there at the moment. If I could comment on the school question, because this does come back to the heart of the matter. I think it refers to Stockport's MP talking about making schools COVID secure. Well, I think New Zealand thought it could be COVID secure because it's an island in the middle of nowhere. It didn't work. I think you can't do it there. We certainly won't be able to do with our schools. So this is an issue about assessing risk and managing risk. Starting point for that is being real about what's been happening over the last few months. If we think our young people have all been sat at home in wonderful isolation all the time, not in the real world. If the sun was shining at the moment outside my house where I am now, there'll be loads of kids in the street playing together because that's what they've been doing every day. There'll be older young people will be gathering in various places. All that mixing has been taking place anyway. It's partly reflected in the figures we're getting in parts of Greater Manchester for COVID cases, but we're going to be a lot better at taking effective measures if we start with the reality of what's happening. In terms of schools, the evidence we've got so far is that young people themselves are, unless they have other health issues, are at very low levels of risk. There's more recent evidence that suggests that they are less likely to transmit than older people, but they can still transmit. And that means actually the risk comes down to older adults, and particularly who are vulnerable. If we know that information to start with, then that's how we start to manage it, to make sure that we protect the people who do need protection in those sorts of circumstances. And if we start taking that risk-based approach to managing COVID-19, we won't eliminate it. You'll need a cure and vaccine to eliminate it, but we ought to be able to keep it under control. And we also ought to be able to ensure that those people who are most vulnerable are kept safe, particularly as we go through the winter.
Thanks, Richard. Bev?
Thanks, Ross. I think possibly the only thing we can say with certainty about this infection is that the progress of this pandemic will not be on a linear trajectory. As Andy and Richard have both said, it's volatile. We can see that from evidence not just here in the UK, but from around the world, where you know, the picture changes and can change quite quickly in terms of what's happening. It's very positive that we've got a better picture now, in that the impact on the people who are getting infected is much, much less serious. And the figures Richard gave in terms of hospitalisation and deaths are very encouraging. I think we're all aware, though, that we need to treat that with caution. Firstly, because I think that the most vulnerable people to this illness still aren't mixing socially very much at all. And so we don't know, if the infection rises, what impact that would have on them were they to become infected. It may be the same as before. It may be that the virus has mutated somewhat, but we actually just don't know. So we need caution for that reason, that those vulnerable people still aren't mixing socially at all very much. And secondly, we will face new challenges in terms of potential for infections. Richard has just mentioned schools. That's one. Despite the low level of infection amongst very young children, I think it is seen to be higher in older age groups, and the potential for transmission. But also, I just wanted to highlight the point Andy had made about students. Across Greater Manchester, in the next few weeks, we'll have between 70 and 100,000 students coming back into our city region. And this is traditionally, through September, a time of many, many parties and socialising as people come back together in their universities and colleges. And I do think that's a time for students to be conscious, really, of maybe being mindful of not doing that to the extent that they might have done in another time. However, notwithstanding those challenges, I think the real need for us is to have the ability to be responsive and flexible in relation to the situation as it evolves. And I think that's what the message today has been about.
Thanks, Bev. I think you've all got to get off now, so I think that'll be us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Ross.
Thanks.
Thanks.